Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on which time zone you're joining us from. It is 11 a.m. in Moscow time, so this is the time to officially start our session. Welcome to the Marine Research and Education 2021 International Sessions. Before we proceed, I just wanted to take this moment to also welcome you and invite you to the second session of today, which is the special session on biofouling communities, which will start at 4 p.m. Moscow time. If you're interested but haven't registered, there is still time to do so. But for now, welcome to the special session on biodiversity conservation in the high seas and polar regions. My name is Anna Gebrug. I'm going to be your host for today. And this is the overview of the first part of the day. We are going to have two sub-sessions today with a small coffee break in between them. And with that, I think we are going to proceed to the first section of our day today, which is focused on biodiversity conservation in the Southern Ocean, and more specifically on the Hamler, the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. In this part of the session, we are going to have two amazing speakers. And without further delay, I'm going to proceed to the first talk by Dr. Rodolfo Werner. Rodolfo, over to you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be presenting to you. I'm going to be talking about Antarctic marine protected areas, which I think is a great way to start this seminar on about the biodiversity conservation of the Southern Ocean. So as I said before, I will be talking to you about Antarctic marine protected areas. My name is Rodolfo Werner. I am from Argentina and based in Argentina, and I work for the Pew Charitable Trusts and the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. Many of you might know the Antarctic Treaty was signed in 1961, and under this treaty, all the water and land south of 60 degrees south was devoted to peace and science. There were 12 original signatories of the treaty. Of course, the Russian Federation was one of them, but right now we have 54 treaty parties. 29 of them are considered consultative parties. That is, they have the right to vote, and we have another 25 non-consultative parties. When the treaty was signed, nobody thought that fishing could take place in this very remote area of the world. But fair enough, by the 1960s, there was a growing fishery for krill happening in this area. And the concern on the growing of the fishery, that was what triggered the creation, the establishment of a new convention, which is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR. In this map, you can see the area of the convention, which covers all the area of the treaty, that is all the water south of 60 degrees south. But in some other areas, I mean, the convention area includes also the waters around sub-Antarctic islands. Those islands, of course, are the sovereignty of certain countries. The headquarters of CAMLR, where the secretariat is based, are in Hobart, Tasmania, that is Australia. Here you see a picture of the headquarters of CAMLR. CAMLR is managed by the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, which includes 25 member countries and the European Union. The Commission meets once a week for 2 weeks. The first week is actually the meeting of the scientific committee, and in which all the work that have been conducted throughout the year on the different technical working groups is being discussed. In parallel, we have the meeting of SCIC, the Standing Committee on Inspection and Compliance. So all the meetings are being conducted in the four official languages, of the Antarctic Treaty, which are Spanish, Russian, French, and English. So all the discussions are being interpreted in the four languages. After the first week, both committees they adopt reports that are then translated so that Monday morning, the second week, that's when the commission starts, they have these reports available. And those reports are part of the dealings, the discussions of the commission. And the commission, of course, is the political body that has the power to take decisions. One important thing to remember that all decisions are being done following consensus. Consensus is something that is embedded in the Antarctic Treaty. So this is part of the, it works like in the Antarctic Treaty. So every single decision will be agreed by each individual countries. Of course, we have also observers. Under those observers, we have observer countries and countries that are not members of the CAMLR, international organizations like, for example, FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and of course, the NGO representatives under the umbrella of the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition. That is, every NGO that would like to attend this meeting has to do it under ASOC. Also, we have members of the fishing industry that have also observer status in these meetings. Let's now look at the issue of Antarctic marine protected areas. Well, you might ask yourself, why marine protected areas or MPAs in the Southern Ocean? The answer is very simple. It's like, first of all, marine protected areas are a good tool in order to provide protection to biodiversity, and that is protection of unique ecosystems and endemic species. Also, by closing the areas to fishing activities, they become very good climate change reference areas. Not having fishing there, the only impacts that you might see in the area, the only changes, they will be due to climate change. And of course, the normal environmental changes that are typical of every ecosystem. Also, they act as scientific reference areas with global reference. So these areas can be compared with other areas in the world. And of course, it's important to provide some protection to certain areas in the context of a growing fishing industry. That fishing industry targets Antarctic krill and the Antarctic toothfish. So let's look at the process when it comes to marine. In 2002, that was the first time the CAMLR established marine protected areas as an official agenda item. So an item that was being discussed by the different committees and then the commission. There were several things that were done over the next following years, especially in 2006, CAMLR conducted an exercise, a bioregionalization exercise, in order to identify bioregions in the Southern Ocean. As a result of that, in 2008, 11 priority areas were identified. The next year, in 2009, the first marine protected area was established south of the South Orkney Islands, as you can see there in the red circle. 2 years thereafter, in 2011, CAMLR moved from the bioregions, these priority areas, into a new system, which is called the CAMLR planning domains. So basically, the whole Southern Ocean was divided in 9 areas being called planning domains, and this is the way CAMLR decided to start working on developing marine protected areas proposals, taking into account these domains. Also that year, CAMLR agreed a conservation measure 9104. Conservation measures are basically the way the convention is being managed. So the decisions are being translated into what's called conservation measures that are adopted once again by consensus. So the conservation measure 9104, which is the general framework for marine protected areas, was key in providing the right methodology in order to develop proposals for marine protected areas. So basically, any proposal that you might develop has to follow the requirements of this conservation measure. So what is the current situation about existing and proposed marine protected areas, and what are some of the obstacles that we've seen over the years? I'm referring now to the early years of the process, starting in 2011, when there were some preliminary presentations of proposals, but officially in 2012, 2 proposals for MPAs were presented in Hamler, one for the Rossi, presented by the US and New Zealand, and another second one for East Antarctica, presented by the EU, France, and Australia. Here we have the map where it shows the area where the Rossi is located, the red circle. Here we have the area that corresponds to East Antarctica, which is basically the projection of the Australian continent into Antarctica. So there were 2 proposals, as I mentioned, presented in 2012. And what happened is that Hamler that year failed to reach consensus on the 2 proposals. Delegates were very frustrated with the whole situation, and so the commission agreed to have a special meeting in July 2013 in Bremerhaven, Germany, being Germany one of the members of Hamler, to discuss specifically these 2 MPA proposals. So fair enough, this meeting happened in July 2013 in Bremerhaven, and so there were many activities happening over a week. We had also press conference, like you can see there, and then on the right bottom, the ASOC, the Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, we provide interventions as we normally do in the meetings, in which we present our ideas, we call the attention to certain priorities, and so we participate in meetings. We don't have, of course, a vote because we're not a member, but we have the opportunity to share our expertise and our views to the Commission. Unfortunately, that year in Bremerhaven, Hamler failed again to agree on the 2 proposals. And so many members were very disappointed, especially Germany as being the host country and the organizer of this special meeting. But, as I said, unfortunately, the 2 MPA proposals were not agreed. So what happened thereafter in the next following years? Let's look at the Rossi. So the Rossi MPA proposal, as I mentioned, was presented for the first time in 2012, 2013, then again in Bremerhaven. And then in 2014, at the annual meeting of Hamler, the proposal was presented in this shape. As you can see, the areas here under the red circle, the white areas, or kind of light orange, light pink, and here too, these areas that were proposed as no-take. Whereas this green square in the middle that was proposed as an area for limited fishing for Patagonian and Antarctic toothfish. So in this way, this proposal was allowing for some fishing to take place in the Ross Sea, but was proposing a big area to be no-take. Of course, 2014, the proposal was not agreed again, and so a year thereafter, some adaptations to the proposal were again conducted. And so as you can see here in this map, the area, the green area, was enlarged, including a new square here in the right bottom of the map. And so that area was, as I mentioned before, proposed as a limit fishing area for toothfish. Whereas the area in light blue here is the area that was proposed for no-take here too, in this area too. But this area, not only no-take, but it was identified as a spawning protection zone. That year, Hamler didn't agree on the MPA once again. But that year, there was an interesting development. The US declared the Ross Sea as a top diplomatic priority. So some conversations started, and there was a special meeting in September 2015 where President Obama then and President Xi Jinping from China met and discussed, among other things, this proposal for an MPA. That year, shortly thereafter, the Hamler met in October 2015. China decided to endorse the MPA proposal for the Rossi, with the caveat of including, as you can see in this picture here, in this map here, what is called the KRZ in the green circle, which is a krill research zone, an area which there could be some research fishing for krill. The other the big area here is what was called an no-take area, like here and here, the two small squares, and the area here in the middle, where it says SRZ, is what it was defined as the special research zone, where again research fishing for toothfish could take place. So China endorsed the proposal, which was a key development in all this. Next year, in 2016, the U.S. engaged in several conversations at a very high diplomatic level with the Russian Federation. And fortunately enough, after all these conversations, Russia decided to endorse also the proposal. And so what happened then that year, the Rossi Marine Protected Area was established. So in summary, the MPA was proposed by the US and New Zealand. And allow me to say something here, which is very important. I mean, countries, when they present a proposal, they do it because normally they have data for that area, they have presence there because they have a research station, or because they've been conducting research in that particular area. But once the marine protected area gets established, it becomes a Hamler marine protected area. So the Commission is responsible for the management of the area. So it's not a marine protected area that belongs to any country, so there are no geopolitics implications in creating the MPA. On the contrary, it becomes a marine protected area of Hamler, of the convention. That's a very important thing that we have to keep in mind. Again, the size of the Rossi MPA is about 2 million square kilometers, was located in the domain 8, here in the bottom, and as I said, was proposed preliminary the first time in 2011 and adopted in 2016. That year, it was a huge year for Hamler, a milestone in the history of Hamler that was established in 1982. So, and here we have several events that were happening outside the headquarters. Like there was a school from Hobart, local school, that came and brought different drawings they made about the fauna in Antarctica, and they were meeting the different heads of delegations of the different countries, as you can see here from Chile, Uruguay, Korea, China, and here in the middle we have the executive director of Hamler then, and the chair of the commission, which was from the Russian Federation. So that was a very important year for Hamler, and we really celebrated the adoption of the Rossi Marine Protected Area. As you can see in this picture, where I am with our penguin friend, and also with Evan Bloom, the head of delegation of the US. What happened with East Antarctica? The East Antarctica MPA proposal that was, as I mentioned before, proposed in 2012 for the first time by the EU, France, and Australia. Thereafter, last year, Uruguay joined, and this year we had also the US and Korea to join this proposal. But the size of this proposal is not as big as the Rossi MPA. 950,000 square kilometers, is located in the domain 7, and it was originally proposed in 2011. The first proposal for East Antarctica had 7 different areas that were part of the proposed MPA. 4 of them we're looking at benthic and pelagic areas, as you can see there, the list of the different areas, and 3 were directed at benthic areas. What happened is that, so these 7 areas were a matter of discussion, technical discussions, and also political discussions. And so there was a decision being taken by the scientific committee there to reduce the number of areas to only 3, as you can see in this map here, with the hope, of course, that the other 4 areas will be taken into consideration in the future, since these areas were identified as priority areas for conservation. So 2015, that is the way the proposal was looking. But making a long story short, CAMLR had failed to agree on East Antarctica MPA since 2016. So all these different years, the proposal has been over and over presented and has been adopted. And it's important to know that every proposal goes through a particular process. I mean, it starts at the level of the working groups, then this is being discussed at the scientific committee. And once the scientific committee, by consensus, decides that the proposal has the best science available, and this is a very important element in CAMLR, the best science available. So once the scientific committee agrees on that, this proposal goes to the hands of the commission. And the East Antarctica has been, is in the hands of the commission since 2015. So the committee agreed, has the best science available, and now is in the hands of the commission. And basically now what we're waiting is a political decision. It's no more a technical decision. Unfortunately, I have to say that the 2 CAMLR member countries that have been not allowing to reach consensus has been China and Russia, the Russian Federation. Another proposal is for the Weddell Sea. The Weddell Sea is the area that is located to the east of the Antarctic Peninsula, as you can see here in this picture. This proposal was originally presented by the EU, Germany, and now in 2019, Norway joined, and I'm going to be talking a bit more about that. And the proposed area covers more than 2 million square kilometers, the phase 1, and I'm going to be talking about the phase 1. The location is the domain 3, and it was originally proposed in 2016, and then in 2018, it was adopted, and as you can see in this map, in phase 2 and phase 1. The red line is the prime meridian, so meridian 0, and phase 1 is all the water to the west of the prime meridian until you reach the peninsula. And the phase 2 is from the prime meridian, the waters to the east. The development of the proposal started in April 2014 in Bremerhaven, Germany, with the first workshop on this proposal. This is not a year after the failure of CAMLR, also in Bremerhaven, to agree on the first 2 marine protected areas. So anyway, the proposal went through several meetings and discussions and with members at the technical level. And so the next year they had a second workshop, this time also in Germany, but this time in Berlin, and also in April in 2015, where this proposal, continued to be discussed at the technical level. This proposal then was finalized after all these different changes and throughout the workshops into the final proposal that was presented in 2018, as you can see here in this map. Especially, it's very easy to recognize the proposal here on the left side on the green areas. But there was a time when Norway was not supportive of this proposal, and so after several conversations and negotiations with Norway decided to join, and so then by the next year there was a change that was the result of these discussions with Norway, and the proposal was divided, as I mentioned at the beginning, in a phase 2, which is the area to the west of the prime meridian, and phase 2, which is the area to the east of the prime meridian. Actually, phase 1 is the one that is being negotiated at the, it was negotiated at technical level, now is in the hands of the Commission. And with phase 2, the Norway is collecting more and more information, and they're going through the process in order to come up with a specific proposal for that area. The other proposal that is being discussed in Hamler is the proposal for the Antarctic Peninsula. As many of you might know, this is, as you can see in the little map here in the middle, this is the peninsula that stands out from Antarctica, very well known, very rich on fauna, and very rich on krill, also Antarctic krill. So the proponents of this proposal are Argentina and Chile, and it's very important that these two countries are claimants to this area, but instead of competing, they are collaborating and presenting this proposal for an MPA, which is a very important thing, and I guess strengthen the spirit and the the nature of the Antarctic Treaty. So it's very, very good. The size proposed to be under the marine protected area is 670,000 square kilometers. It's located what is called the Domain 1. So many times this proposal is being referred as D1 MPA proposal. So Domain 1 MPA proposal. And although in 2017 there was a preliminary presentation at the scientific committee, in 2018 was when officially the proposal was presented to the scientific committee. The process in order to get there to the 2018 proposal started actually in 2011 in a workshop in Valdivia in Chile. That was a workshop in which particularly they were focusing on trying to identify which were the priority areas in order to indicate in the proposal. Between 2011 and 2015, Argentina and Chile, they had several binational meetings to discuss how to proceed and to discuss technical information, until in 2015, a second international workshop was organized with participation of the different Camera members, as was also the case at the first workshop. And also, these workshops, they also invited observers. And so I had the great opportunity of participate on the development of this proposal from the very beginning, since Valdivia. So I've been very close to the discussions and the data gathering and the different processes that were taking place throughout the development of this proposal. The one important thing to take into consideration when we look at the Antarctic Peninsula is that this is the area, or as you can see in the map, where the krill fishery concentrates. If you look at the map here on the left, you see the catches for Antarctic krill between 1980 and 1989. At that time, you had a lot of catches happening in East Antarctica, and also some catches happening in the peninsula area. But from 2010 to nowadays, the fishing for Antarctic krill is concentrated in the peninsula, in the South Orkney Islands, and in South Georgia. But the Antarctic Peninsula is one of the most important very important foraging area for penguins, seals, and whales, especially during the summer, during the breeding season. And it's also an area where the fishery likes to go and fish. So there is a very tight overlap between the foraging areas and the fishing grounds. When I started working on this, that was like 20 years ago. I've been working, focusing on the management of the krill fishery. So I've been following all this. I normally represent ASOC as the scientific committee representative, and like I said, I'm focusing on the management of the krill fishery. So when I started, like 20 years ago, 18 years ago, actually, the catches at that point were less than 100,000 tons. Now the catches have increased and reached last year 450,000 tons in the year. So we had been seeing this increase, steady increase in the krill fishery. So that's something that we should take into consideration. Kamalar is working towards a new scheme in order on how to manage the fishery that is being developed in parallel to the development of the marine protected area. So both processes are going hand by hand. An important also element to take into consideration in this area is that we've been seeing a massive reduction, a reduction of 50% of the population level of certain colonies of Adelie and chinstrap penguins in the Antarctic Peninsula in the last 30 years. That's something that we are very concerned. This area is going through a massive changes. So climate change is actually one of the biggest threats to this area. Although, as you know, Antarctica is not a place that produces a lot of CO2. The Antarctic Peninsula is one of the areas that has been receiving most of the impacts, or a lot of the impacts of especially global warming, with a reduction because of that, because of the increase in the temperature of air and water. We're seeing a decrease in the sea ice, and the sea ice is very important in the life cycle of krill. So that's something that's also a matter of concern. So in summary, the threats to the Antarctic Peninsula area are the concentrated krill fishing operations, because as I mentioned, they overlap with the foraging areas of especially penguins during the breeding season, because krill fishing takes place in very localized areas and very close to the coast. Also, the impact of climate change with a massive reduction of sea ice in the area. And of course, we have also the concentrated tourism, which is a growing industry, and 99% of tourism activities are conducted in the Antarctic Peninsula area. So in order to develop the proposal for the Antarctic Peninsula Marine Protected Area, they used the program MARESEDU that many of you might be familiar with, and they will including in this analysis more than 176 layers of information. So those different layers of information include, many features. As you can see here, for example, foraging areas of penguins and seals. I'm just showing some of them just to give you an idea. Also, important bird areas being included. Also, areas that are key as nurseries for Antarctic krill. Also, areas that are being used for humpback whales and the foraging activities during the summer. Also, the movement and the use of the areas by orcas, the killer whales, and many other biological and geophysical physical information was included in the analysis with the MARESEDU. The result of this analysis is what you see here, which are all these blue areas, which are the areas that were identified in the analysis as priority areas. So these are the areas that you take into consideration if you want to provide protection to very key and important features of this area. Of course, you cannot create a marine protected area following a diffuse area. So an exercise was conducted in trying to encompass all these areas within areas with clear limits, as you can see here. And the preliminary proposal that I mentioned that was presented in 2017 was looking like this, where all these kind of pink areas surrounding the South Shetland Islands, Elephant Island, and the peninsula, and here to the south, these areas which are very important for krill nursery. And here, of course, we have the South Open. So this was a preliminary proposal, but the official proposal was this. This is the way it was looking at that moment, in which the areas in blue are the areas that were proposed as no take, so no fishing. The areas in red were areas that were proposed to be alternating. So they were supposed to be closed for 10 years and then open for 10 years, and so in an alternate way. And the big area in yellow, that is the area that was proposed to for continuation of the krill fishing operation following the current conservation measures. This proposal was then discussed. There were several bilateral meetings between different members, and by the 2019, and this is the current proposal, this is the way it looks. There were some changes made. So the dark gray area are the areas that are proposed as no take, and this big light gray areas are the areas where krill fishing operations are proposed to be continuous and following the current conservation measures, which is like business as usual right now in those areas. Of course, CAMALAR is working, like I said, to this new management of the krill fishery, so we will see how CAMALAR agrees on how to manage those krill fishing areas. But so you can see this is the map right now that is still at the hands of the scientific committee. So in summary, like if you look at the, first of all, if you look at the different proposals that are being discussed, the East Antarctica is a proposal that is in the hands of the Commission, so it needs a political decision. The same happens with the Weddell Sea, so both proposals were considered as having the best science available, and the Antarctic Marine Protected Area, Antarctic Peninsula Marine Protected Area proposal, that is still in the hands of the scientific committee. We need the scientific committee to agree by consensus that it has the best science available. And I have to say, this proposal has been developed over a very long time in a very transparent, participative way, and getting feedback year after year from the scientific committee and the working groups. So in summary, the current situation is that there are no new MPAs that were adopted in the recent years. And also the last two meetings of CAMALAR have been conducted. Actually, the 2020 was conducted virtually, and this year had a kind of mix of presence and as a formal meeting and a virtual meeting. But anyway, unfortunately, some members have been discussing or have been not agreeing on having the full agenda of the meeting. That includes, unfortunately, the Russian Federation, and so and arguing that there is not enough time to discuss substantive matters, and so the issues that proposed not to be included have been always climate change and marine protected areas. So I have to say that unfortunately over the last few years, the two CAMALAR members that have been not allowing to reach consensus on the marine protected areas that are being considered by the Commission are China and the Russian Federation. So since the proposals were presented, as I mentioned before, many members have been joining as co-proponents of the different marine protected areas. So with this, I would like to thank you for your time. I tried to provide you a summary of the current situation, the history of all this, which is very rich in information and discussions and so on. So I'm trying to give you at least this very short summary. This is my email address. If you'd like to contact me, I'm very happy to receive any comments or questions and so on. And always happy to have exchanges with whoever might be interested. Well, again, thank you very much for everything. And I wish you that you continue to have a great meeting today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rodolfo, for this fantastic overview and walk through the history of different MA proposals and the development of Hamler in the Southern Ocean. So this was our first keynote speak of today, and I am very happy to welcome our next speaker today, Елена Жаркова, who is representative of Antarctic and Southern Ocean Coalition, who is also a co-organizer of the session today. And Елена actually has been actively participating in person in Hamler meetings right now over the last couple of days. So hopefully we can ask some questions about this later. But for now, Елена will talk us through the contributions of the Russian scientific community into biodiversity research and conservation in the Southern Ocean. So, Елена, over to you now. You can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Добрый день, коллеги. Очень рада за такую предоставленную возможность.
My presentation will be called like Comprehensive Research and International Scientific Cooperation in the Southern Ocean. The thing is that just 10 minutes ago, the meeting of Hamler took place and it was completed. And unfortunately, this year we couldn't reach consensus, and the marine protected areas was not adopted, and the climate change declaration was not adopted either. I'd like to start my presentation with these two slides, which demonstrate the importance of the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean for the ecosystem of the global ocean in general. On this slide, you can see the marine currents and how the Southern Ocean combines it all in one system. You can see a 3D model here on this slide. Circumpolar currents surround the Antarctic, and the water substitution, the water circulation happens in the global ocean. We can see it in layers, the medium, the top and bottom level. We also can see the saturation with nutrients, with the oxygen, and it is brought around across all the oceans and reaches the Arctic. From this point, I'd like to start, and I have to demonstrate this interesting scientific data confirming the importance of the Southern Ocean. Now I'd like to move to history. Why Antarctic is so important for us, and what is the role of Russia in this history. Some 200 years ago, the first polar expedition was organized on two shallops. Our two scientists, two pioneers, Fadi Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev, approached the shores of the Antarctic. They registered very thick ice and discovered a new continent. And they set up first maps describing very well the continent of the Antarctic and its borders. Later, 150 years later, in 1946, the Soviet ships made an expedition there, and with that point, year on year, the expedition was growing. One of the best research were made, and starting from 1992, we have our Russian Antarctic expedition. We have a huge scientific heritage, starting from the discovery of the continent in this region, first maps, then the great Soviet nature, science, fundamental research. And let's move now to the current days, to modern times. Within the expedition, we carry out oceanographic research, the scientific research expedition. Vessels are working there. We research the marine probes and the shelf. We make oceanographic survey of the onshore, and we use also marine probes in the area around the shore. We carry out biological research and chemical research in the Antarctic seas. The work is done from the 2 research vessels. Also, we accept and analyze satellite measurements of temperature gradients, other temperature gradients registration by direct contact. The next type of the research which I wanted to mention are hydrographic work. Hydrographic and navigation work provide safe navigation in the waters of the Antarctic. We all know about the roaring 40s and 50s and 60s. The ice condition is very complicated there, and not all ships can enter those waters. To provide proper safety, our ships visit these regions, and they are involved in measuring depth and collect and analyze data on the ice conditions on the routes and prepare recommendations for the ships which will move in these areas. It is very important to note that to provide ice information, the specialists built up scientific services of different directions. They carry out survey and airborne surveys and satellite survey and tie it to maps properly. Marine geophysical research. These scientific research are done from the boards of the research vessel Alexander Karpinski, and these scientific vessels provide special magnetic research in the vicinity of sedimentary rocks and many other research. I'm going to give a broad overview now. Let's move to the marine biological research. This is visual research of population and species composition of marine birds and mammals, core logging of the ice in the route of the vessels with the research of plankton and krill, research of physical and chemical characteristics of the sea ice of Antarctic and core logging, and also benthic research. I'd like to move now to the expedition which is prepared for 2021-2026. We all know about the importance of the climate change and its impact for all regions of our planet and how it is connected with the biodiversity. All our fundamental scientific research should help us to preserve our planet, and as mentioned during the meeting of Hamler, we should follow up the rationality of the resource use. This expedition, which is planned, should be based on the ecosystem approach to research the ecosystem of the Southern Ocean. This is the evaluation of the modern climatic trends and the evaluation of its impact on the scientific complex and environmental complex of this region, research of functional parameters and spatial organization of benthic and pelagic systems, evaluation of ecosystem parameters in the Southern Ocean, which provide potential opportunity to source biological resources, and research of anthropogenic and man-made influence. You can see the map of the route of this expedition and the regions involved in it. 1 second, please. I have to change the slide now. I hope you can hear me. Wonderful. Let's move on. What tasks are set by this program? Evaluation of hydrophysical processes, condition of the marine environment, structure and functional parameters of the ecosystem of Antarctic waters in the key regions of the ocean fronts, and large-scale circulation of the Southern Ocean, which I showed you in the beginning. research of the water replacement between the Weddell Field and Bransfield Strait, research of hydrophysical processes and frontal areas in the Powell Basin, research of benthic areas and deep channels, biological and population characteristics, evolution of the Atlantic krill and its relations with the pelagic ecosystem of the Southern Ocean. Of course, involvement of young scientists, which is especially important because there are big prospects for the science in general in this region, and the research will be done by ways of oceanographic polygons, sections, and separate stations from academic Keldysh research vessel. In the season of 2021-2022, the Institute of Ocean Science will have a route on the shelf in the Weddell Sea. You can see here the map. Approximately 100 marine stations are planned along the whole route. It's going to be marine stations, sounding stations, and different kind of survey stations. And now I'd like to move to the topic which is very important. It is very important to exchange information and cooperate because the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean is the area for the science and cooperation. And what we see during the meetings of Hamler and the Antarctic Treaty, it is very important to provide a large-scale research of this region due to its critical importance and cooperation of big scientific teams. I'd like to cite a few researchers of the international teams in this sphere, and Russian scientists took part in this work. This study was done this year. This is interdisciplinary research organized by the Wilson Center. It is a scientific lab, and scientists from Hamler and Antarctic Treaty were involved in this process, and from APCC, the Commission on the Climate Change. All these leading scientists dealing with this region discuss different factors, what specifically happens in the southern region and in the Antarctic, and how it will impact all of us. Initially, we looked at maps, the whole world and global ocean is connected, and I'd like to describe you a few processes which specifically happen in the Antarctic region. On this chart you can see those processes, especially what happens there is glacier retreat. It's changing on the continental shelf of ecosystems, contraction of sea ice and shelf ice avalanche. A lot of penguins, big herds and big families of penguins live on these ice shelves, and there are tragic histories with flooding of big families of birds, changing of acidity of the ocean waters, and different properties of differences in the properties of CO2 absorption. It is thought that around 40% of the CO2 were captured by the Southern Ocean. What would it mean? It means warming of the ocean and changes in the krill, for instance, in the leaf ice. Everyone knows what happens in the Arctic. The ice is retreating. Polar bears have problems with finding forage, and they come closer to people. In the Antarctic, the situation is also complicated. The ice is retreating, and for penguins, it is difficult to find forage, and they have no opportunity to replenish it because the Antarctic is a desert, an ice desert, and the population is shrinking, and it also impacts all populations of penguins. But it has not been researched to the end, and what are the further trends there? What would it mean for the global nature systems? Of course, it will be increase of the sea level, changing of meteorological conditions, and climate change, it is related with the growing number of natural calamities, changing the temperature, and the oceans absorb 90% of excessive heat. And due to these current systems, which I showed you in different, it brings the cooling system. The cooling system of our planet is the Southern Ocean, the Antarctic, and the Arctic. And Antarctic accounts for a very big share of excessive heat, and the climate is changing and temperature is changing there rapidly. The changes of habitats due to the shifts in the forage bases, forage reserves, new species come to the Antarctic and there could be a replacement, and this is a very complicated process. The loss of the living space and biodiversity is directly related to natural calamities. Higher level of acidity and reef are impacted by that, and a big number of shellfish, changing of fishery conditions. The temperature is rising in some regions, and fish is moving away, going to the south or to the north, and due to temperature, fish is moving and fishery also is moving. And a very important factor is the reduction of CO2 level absorbed by the ocean. The scientists tell now that a lot of greenhouse gases is absorbed by the ocean, and in the future all these opportunities will be exhausted and the ocean won't be able to excessively absorb it, and it will emit it, and then we will face a very serious climate change problems. The scientists give certain recommendations. First and foremost, this is Paris Agreement. The next step is establishing of the marine protected areas, which my colleague Rodolfo mentioned, which is very important for biodiversity and support of ecosystems. Updating the regional strategies for fishery industry management due to the climate change. This is a very important topic, and additionally we have to stress a precautionary approach when making decisions in the southern region. A precautionary approach is an approach which is used very often in the international law and environment issues, telling us that all activities should be precautionary, because amid the drastic changes we are living, we are not able to calculate all threats and risks. We should not combat what has already happened, but make sure to prevent it from happening. And this is the establishing of the network of marine protected areas around the Arctic. I'm going to change my slide now and will tell you about a few more interesting researches. The system is hanging a little bit. Oh, now it happens. Okay, that's fine. So in 2020, a very interesting article was published. It is an international cooperation of a number of scientists. Unfortunately, our scientists were not part of this research, but this is an international study, and the Nature magazine published an article that 4,000 trackers, satellite trackers, marked different vermits, birds, seals, and whales were marked. And this first map is the moving of these marks. In the middle we see the compilation of the most important areas, mapping, and here on this map we see the comparison of these environmental areas and the map of the MPAs, which we've discussed and less than an hour ago finished this discussion at Hamler meeting. You see how they are overlapping for vermits with the proposed and already existing MPAs. This is the map showing the existing areas. These are areas created in the sub-Antarctic regions, and they are marine protected areas created and established by different countries. The first and big marine protected area of Hamler is the Ross Sea, and it is very clearly seen the how important this area is for vermets and animals. Another international study was discussed at Hamler. That was the creation of the map of areas important for marine mammals. This study is done within the SCAR, the Scientific Committee of Antarctic Treaty, and IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature, and different scientists from 11 countries, based on the parameters, and you can learn more from these parameters from this website. In orange, we mark the important areas for marine mammals. In red, we mark zones which are candidates for these important areas for marine mammals, and in blue we mark the areas of interest. And it's very easy to compile the network of marine protected areas discussed by Hamler with the scientific data which are important for marine mammals. We should note that we have a very big Soviet heritage of whale fishery, not so easy. We have our responsibility to restore populations in these regions, to restore populations of whales. This year, 3 dead whales were found during fishery operations. It's going to be investigated. Probably it is related with the krill fishery, and 2 vessels found these dead bodies, dead whales. The reasons are not clear, and these important marine mammals areas are very important for whales, especially, and for foraging, and any kind of fishery should be based on sustainable approach, rational approach, should take into account ecosystems, and should look into the future. What is important? What else I wanted to mention, which is always interesting for scientists? The Secretariat of Hamler established open source databases, and you can find links in this presentation. On these links, under these links, you can find a lot of data, a lot of information relevant for those projects. Practically within each MPA there's a plan of monitoring and research, and these plans are updated every 5 to 10 years, and based on the collected data on MPAs, probably some changes are taken into account. There are basic data, and it is very important and interesting. Also, the UK, they have established a number of marine protected areas, and they created a database where you can see the geographical system and other information. Physical activities, geophysical activities, very interesting databases. Please don't hesitate to use them in your activity. It will be very important and useful in a number of international research. And well, to open and to close our discussion with the fact that I mentioned the great heritage of scientific research of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, and how important now is the Russian Antarctic expedition is, I described a few distant research our scientists could take part of. I told you about recent publications of research where our scientists didn't take part, but it would be nice to involve them too. And now we have a decade of oceans. The topic is becoming more and more relevant and important, and I'd like to move to the discussion how we could set up our cooperation, our relations of our scientists and people who are dealing with biodiversity conservation in open seas. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have questions, the organizers have all my contacts. Now I stop sharing my screen, and good luck to you. Let's continue our discussion.
Thank you so much, Elena, for this very comprehensive overview of scientific research and some scientific data that provides background to those processes and discussions that we were hearing about in the first talk by Rodolfo. So what is going to happen now? Unfortunately, Rodolfo couldn't join us today for this part of the discussion due to the time difference. And Елена is going to be with us later in the day in the panel discussion as well. So we probably won't take too many questions right now, just to make sure that we still have a coffee break as well. But there is still space for just 1 or 2 questions to Елена right now before we go on a coffee break. So to ask your questions, you can either type them in the chat box or raise your hand, and I will pass the microphone to you. But I will start probably with asking you, Елena, to maybe just give us some highlights about the Hamler meetings this year. So yeah, if you had to summarize maybe 1 or 2 highlights personally to you, could you share what would that be?
The meeting took place in a good manner. We had a chance to discuss a lot of topics, but unfortunately, we couldn't meet the most important decisions for us. Unfortunately, we couldn't meet the decisions on biodiversity conservation. The consensus on MPAs in the southern region was not reached. The climate change declaration was not adopted either. That's why we are about to continue this discussion in order to reach a consensus next year. And it would be great to involve as many scientists as possible in this discussion during this year. To reach consensus next year, because this form of cooperation and these measures to conserve biodiversity outlined in Rodolfo presentation is evident.
Thank you so much, Елена. Yeah, I'm sure that we will have a chance to come back to this conversation later in the panel sessions, where some of our other speakers also have been participating in the Hamler meetings recently. So I will probably ask just one final question before we go on the coffee break. And this would be, so we've heard a lot of examples of the current discussions about the proposals of marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean and some of the difficulties in achieving them. If you had to summarize, what are the key priorities for marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean in the near future? What would be those, in your opinion?
It's difficult to say what should be the key priority there. It is extremely important to continue this discussion and to take part in international workshops, to establish marine protected areas using wide scientific teams which are able to consider biodiversity conservation from different angles and from the point of view of different interests. Not only from the point of view of using resources and geopolitics, but also from the point of view of the new agenda, such as climate change impact, UN Sustainable Development Goals, and biodiversity conservation, which is now the top priority on the agenda of international communication.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Елена, for both for your talk and for this discussion. And with that, we're going to wrap up the first half of our day today and start the coffee break. And I also wanted to announce that unfortunately, one of our speakers and co-organizers in the second part of the session today, Maria, had an accident this night. So we are all sending her best wishes and good health. But that means that we will shift the timing just a little bit and reunite at 35 past an hour. And we have a fantastic lineup of both live and pre-recorded talks in the second half of the session. Thank you so much, and see you in 35 minutes past an hour. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Marine Research and Education International Sessions. I hope you enjoyed your coffee break, and we are now going to proceed to the second part of this special session on biodiversity conservation in the high seas and polar regions. So during the first part of the session, we've heard some fantastic overview presentations talking about history of development of Hamler and some of the examples of what sort of research and data are currently collected in the Southern Ocean and what are the processes underlying the creation of marine protected areas in the Southern Ocean. And in the second part of the session, we are going to focus more and continue talking about marine protected areas in the polar regions and beyond. So we have a fantastic lineup of 4 talks guiding us through some of the examples of how marine protected areas are created in both polar regions and beyond in the high seas. And I am very happy to invite our first speaker of the second part of the session today, Professor Callum Roberts from the University of Exeter, to talk us through some of the concepts on protected areas networks on the road for achieving the goals of the 3030 initiative. So Callum, it is over to you now. You can share your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you very much. So what I'm going to do is give a little bit of background to 30 by 30 in the context of trying to establish resilient protected area networks and focusing on the high seas in particular. I think one of the things that we all know now is that the world is changing incredibly rapidly, and that the future is going to be very different from the present day. And what we need to do is to prepare for that future and to manage and protect the ocean in ways that will safeguard both marine life, but also the needs of future generations of people. So given that that future is going to be very different, we need to design resilience into protected area networks. And there are 2 aspects here. One is resistance to change. So an area which is going to change perhaps more slowly than other areas in the ocean. And then resilience, which is the ability to adapt and respond positively and recover from impacts and disturbances over time. And if you look at how marine ecosystems are configured, then we can see that greater resistance and resilience come from certain properties here. One is that populations of animals and plants that are larger tend to be more resilient than those that are smaller. If species are endangered and are on the margins because of depletion, which has happened to many species and is happening right now across the ocean, then they're going to be less resilient to change. A second feature of that is greater reproductive output, and that is both conferred by larger population size, but also by a bigger proportion of large animals that are the more reproductively active ones. And then looking at this sort of above the species level, habitats that are intact and high quality will tend to be better able to adapt than degraded ones. And populations that have high levels of connectivity between areas may also be able to adapt and respond much more effectively. Of course, we also need to design into our protected area networks features that will allow the communities and ecosystems to respond. And that means that there needs to be connectivity in the form of stepping stones for colonization and dispersal of species, and corridors and refuges of last resort. That's particularly important in the context of the polar regions, because these are areas from which species with cold water requirements will not be able to move any further. And these we have to keep these areas in good condition so that they are able to respond. So marine protected areas as a tool have been well tested, and we know a great deal about how they work. They are a very effective way of rebuilding depleted populations of marine life. And we've seen them working in coastal habitats, deep sea habitats, open ocean habitats as well. But we are finding that marine protected areas, as established by many politicians and government agencies, are not doing the job effectively enough because they're not being given enough protection. And the benefits to wildlife and thereby to human society are dependent on us giving them a very high level of protection from extractive use and harm. We recently published a study on this in the journal Science, looking at how marine protected areas are able to function most effectively. And there are a number of aspects to this. This MPA guide sets up two dimensions of MPA performance. One is the stage of establishment, so whether an MPA is proposed, established legally on the water, being managed, and regulations being implemented, and then being actively managed and adaptively managed to respond to how the ecosystem is benefiting from protection. So these are these four stages. And then on the protection level that a place receives, there are four levels of protection that we identify in this paper. One is a minimal level of protection, whereby some activities are restricted. The second is lightly protected, whereby a few more activities are restricted, which confers a little bit more conservation benefit. And then highly protected, in which ecosystems are protected from most forms of extractive use, but subsistence and artisanal extractive uses may still be ongoing. And then fully protected, which corresponds to no-take marine protected areas, as we're familiar with. And so with these four levels of protection, we can then look at the outcomes that you see in protected areas that exist. And we mapped a whole series of outcomes. This is just the top of a very long table, looking at how the higher the level of protection that areas get, the greater the outcome, the benefit to these ecological aspects that I've just been mentioning that confer resistance and resilience. Those aspects are more fully delivered in very highly protected marine areas. And so if we want to increase ocean resilience through the use of marine protected areas, then we have to give them a lot of protection. And this is really in diagrammatic form how the levels of protection that are identified in this study look in terms of the amount of wildlife present in an area. You can see on the left-hand side of this panel that there has been a historic trend of moving from greater abundance and more intact habitats to less abundance and more degraded habitats over time. That's the problem that we have to address. And if we give our protected areas limited protection, minimal or light levels of protection, then we're not going to recover them very far towards those historic levels of biomass. But the highly and fully protected areas are the ones that really do provide the benefits to ecosystems that we need if we're going to create resilient networks of protected areas in the future. So thinking about this, the coverage of marine protected areas, which has been the focus of international negotiations, and 30 by 30 is a target that everyone is talking about, and that many people are hoping will be adopted in Kunming at the Convention on Biological Diversity meeting. that 30 by 30 is relatively meaningless unless we also have a high level of protection within those protected areas. It's not enough to protect 30% of the planet if we don't also give it a high enough level of protection that the wildlife and the ecosystems within those places are bouncing back from human impact. So you can see this sort of equation here, bringing together protected area coverage and the level of protection. So the total benefit that you get from your network of protected areas is equal to the size of protected populations within those protected areas, which is dictated by the level of protection that they get, and the coverage of those protected areas. So those two things multiplied, one by the other, will give you the benefit. So if you were to protect 30% of the sea lightly or minimally, you wouldn't get very much overall benefit. And unfortunately, this is the kind of protection that prevails in a large fraction of the existing protected areas that we have created to date. We need to do better if we genuinely want to use protected areas as a tool to manage the oceans into the future. What would we get if we were to protect them fully or highly from extractive and damaging uses? Well, we would get a lot more marine life. And if we distribute those protected areas across the ocean, then we provide benefits that will extend to all parts of the marine environment. That is important because the connectivity aspects of protected area design that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk are conferred by having dense networks of large and closely spaced protected areas. If you want these populations to interact over space, which is necessary to confer resilience, then you need to have a lot of protected areas. It's no use having a few percent of the ocean protected because the protected areas will be a long way away from each other and they're not going to be interacting. They're not going to be mutually supporting. So how much do we need? Well, a review of the evidence around how much of the ocean we should protect to meet a range of different protected area targets suggests that we need a minimum of 30% of the ocean protected at a high level to ensure sufficient connectivity of populations across space. So where should we put them? That's the next really important challenge. And we heard some very detailed analysis of where you should put protected areas in Rodolfo's talk, and a great deal of effort and investigation was put into the placement of these Antarctic marine protected areas based on, as he said, I think over 170 different data layers of the biophysical environment. So from species and ecosystem presence to foraging areas to corridors for migrating species, all of these factors came into play in designing the network. But ultimately, those factors are based on what we know about the situation now, and those things are going to change in the future because the world is changing. When you don't know what the future world is going to look like, you have to create bet hedging designs, and investors are very used to that. They make bet hedging portfolios of stocks. They buy a whole range of different kinds of industries. They some things going up, some things going down. They pick them as carefully as they can to think that these ones are likely to perform better than others. But in the end, there is this irreducible uncertainty that they have about the future. And the same thing is true of creating protected area networks. We don't know what the future will hold, so therefore we have to create networks of protected areas that will perform well under whatever conditions the future brings. And that means that we need to create networks in the way that investors create their portfolios. And one of the factors that that network has to have is this high level of protection, because otherwise it's not going to be creating sufficiently good conditions for wildlife to thrive, that they're actually going to, that there's going to be any meaningful benefit. We have to represent multiple examples of each habitat. So that's that kind of biodiversity representation, which was underpinning the Antarctic protected area designs. The protected areas need to be large because the more intact an area is, the bigger the population size is within it, the more likely it is to avoid damage and degradation from activities that are encroaching from the edges. And they need to be distributed across the sea, all over the sea, wherever you can put them. So that means that they cover a broad range of environmental conditions. And therefore, if you've got these well-connected networks covering a large fraction of ocean space protected to a high level, then those networks are likely to be able to accommodate any shifts in the distribution of species and ecosystems that are likely to occur in the future. So with some colleagues, we sort of road tested these design principles in looking at what protected area networks might look like for the high seas on the road to 30 by 30. And the answer is that they are extensive and they're likely to be well connected. And if you're targeting 30% coverage, as this top panel indicates, then those protected area networks are going to look something like this. And if you're targeting 50%, and remember, there is a whole body of science that suggests that 50% is better than 30% in terms of safeguarding life on planet Earth. In fact, Half Earth Day was just last week, where there was a conference discussing the need and the methods to protect half of the planet for wildlife and ecosystem integrity. And so we've tested both of these features, and these networks are not networks of isolated protected areas separated by large areas of sea. They're actually distributed networks of protection with pieces of unprotected sea in between. This turns on its head the kind of model of protected area creation that we've been pursuing up to now. One of the things that we did in this design was to try to incorporate resistance and resilience against climate change by identifying areas of the ocean which had greater or lesser variability in terms of their temperatures at the moment. Areas of lower variability, the hope is that they will change less fast and will allow ecosystems to adapt better than in areas that are changing more rapidly. And the other side of that is that we incorporated areas of greater variability in their temperatures, because the ecosystems within those places will be adapted to variable conditions and may be better able to cope with conditions as they change into the future. Of course, none of those is tested, but this is the way that we're trying to create a bet hedging portfolio of places that would perform well under any conditions. So I think when we're moving towards 30 by 30 or even 50% of the world being protected, what we're actually trying to do is to generate and maintain a living planet that is going to help us. One of the features of the negotiations at COP26 next week is going to be the consideration of nature-based solutions to climate change and how we implement them more effectively. No solution to climate change will work if it ignores the ocean. And we need to be thinking about ways to boost the ocean's ability to take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, lock it away in organic matter, and store it for periods of millennia. And intact, productive ecosystems thriving with life is the best way to go about that. The way that we're managing the ocean at the moment is degrading its ability to help us in the battle against climate change. So we need to change, not to save nature, but to save ourselves. And nature is our ally in the fight against climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Callum. That was a wonderful and very inspirational talk. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you just one question now. But if anyone else have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or save them for the panel later. So the question I'm going to ask you is probably very provocative, but I'm curious, what is your personal opinion on what the targets should be? Is it really 30 by 30 or 50, or what is the realistic target if we really want to achieve resilient and healthy oceans in the future?
Yes, I think there are two aspects to that. What is the realistic target ecologically and environmentally, and what is the realistic target politically? If we're going to protect the planet, they need to be the same. So we need to create the conditions under which political action will move towards the right target in an environmental sense. Now, we're not there yet. I think that the world is talking seriously about establishing 30% of the planet as protected areas. That's good. There's over 100 countries that have now signed up to that target. So the political is moving closer to the environmentally necessary level of protection. I think that the science is clear. We do need to be moving up to several tens of % of the planet protected at least. And so that's the language that has been produced in conferences like the World Conservation Congress. Of course, is that enough? Is 30% enough? I think as science progressively improves, we will be able to refine our understanding. My personal view is that we will, in the end, have to move towards 50% of the planet protected. 50 by 50 would be another target, a rallying cry for a new generation of marine scientists, well, yourself included, I think. But, you know, I shall be an old man by the time we get there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Callum. And I'm sure we will have a chance to focus more on sort of how to transition into the action in the panel discussion. But for now, I'm going to thank Callum once again and invite our next speaker. So the next talk is going to be in Russian. So feel free to choose your preferred language in the simultaneous interpretation. And I am very happy to invite Nikita Ovsyannikov to give us an example from the other polar region, from the Arctic, and to talk about the Arctic Nature Reserve Wrangel Island as the model of integrated spatial protection system of natural ecosystems in the polar regions. Nikita, it is over to you now. You can share the screen when you are ready.
Well, thank you, Anna. Well, in fact, I'm going to speak in English, so stay for our interpreters. Buenos dias to everyone. And this time, my brief presentation is going to be focused on first example of territorial conservation of Wrangel Island system, including both land and marine ecosystems of the island, and also on some conclusions that we could and I believe should make out of this example. Wrangel Island is, just to remind you, for those who may not remember, Wrangel Island is a land situated right in the middle of the very vast zone of continental shelf in the border of between East Siberian and Chukchi Sea in the Arctic, rather close to Bering Strait. And this is rather not an island. It's a land, and it's actually the only big land mass laying in the very center of the continental shelf in this geographical zone in eastern part of Eurasian Arctic. Historically, during the times when shelf zone was drained, the island was a mountain land, low mountain land, situated between two major river valleys, which, as we all know, are the main routes for distribution of biodiversity, animal migration. And when sea levels started rising, Wrangel was separated, isolated from the mainland, and remained conserved from influences from the continental ecosystems to a large extent. It has a great diversity of landscape and therefore great biodiversity. And it also is very important factor for forming ice environment, ice habitats around it, because as considering strength and speed of ice shift and wind work. As all islands in the Arctic, Wrangel Island works in a way as an icebreaker, forming open water space around it, even in the midwinter, thus providing great diversity of ice habitat as well, which are important for various species of wildlife, not only for seals and polar bears. Wrangel Island has nowadays, for the last 20 years, has a status of strict nature reserve, category 1A by IUCN classification. It is almost close to 8,000 square kilometers in size, and it also has a kind of like a moon for the Earth, a small satellite island, which is Herald Island, which is a smaller rock northeast from Wrangel Island, which is only 11 square kilometers in size, but very important ecologically as a platform for huge seabird colonies and polar bear denning area, and also survival refuge during ice-free seasons. In addition to its status, in 2004, Wrangel Island received the status of Arctic object. It was the first Arctic object in the UNESCO World Nature Heritage list. And therefore, it was by assigning this status to the reserve, it was internationally recognized as a great, very important contribution of global meaning to the conservation of the Arctic. And it was included in the list of UNESCO World Nature Heritage following two criteria: as an outstanding example of evolutionary development of the biodiversity, and also as a territory that bears exclusively high for the Arctic biodiversity and has all necessary conditions for its real protection. So just briefly, so that you can imagine how really high the biodiversity on the island is, more than 400 vascular plant species inhabit the island, which is 2 to 2.5 times more than in any other Arctic territory of the similar size. It has 23 known endemic species and subspecies of plants, and more than 300 species of mosses and more than 300 species of lichen. A very high number of insects accordingly, which is not a surprise. A big number of birds, more than, nowadays it's more than 180 species of birds recorded, and new species appear almost every year, and obviously due to changes on the planet in the course of global climate change. More than 60 species, bird species, are nesting on the island, including 8 species of seabirds. Number of mammalian species is lower, but all species are very charismatic and important, including polar bears, Arctic foxes, and also 2 species of mistets whales regularly use waters of Wrangel Island in summertime. So, not having time to talk about history, Wrangel was discovered in late 19th century, and then in mid-19th century as a land. It was mapped in the early 19th century by Russian Arctic explorer Ferdinand Wrangel, who failed to visit it personally to reach it. And it has an intensive history of research, exploration, and some stages when the land was targeted as for industrial use, but then fortunately quite quickly in historical time, it was recognized by scientists how unique the ecosystem, land ecosystem of the island is. And listening to recommendations of Soviet ecologists, the government assigned the status of strict nature reserve on 23rd of March 1976. But at the beginning, it was purely land terrestrial strict reserve, which provided protective, fully protected habitats, because all kind of use, consumptive use was excluded, except scientific research, which also meant to be done only by non-invasive methods, which means that no methodology which would harass and harm natural ecosystems and influence the natural course of processes in ecosystems would not be allowed. But I should say that intensive, actually, research, scientific research on the island was started in practically late 1920s when the first settlement was established. But then, since the beginning of 1930s, there was quite intensive research, geological, but also biological and zoological, and really systematic, comprehensive research focusing on inventory of flora and fauna, but also on assemblages of plants and animals, and on particular key importance species, such like snow geese, mufagin predators of polar bears, was started in 1980s, since Wrangel Island Nature Reserve started functioning as a scientific enterprise. And then due to this very intensive research run by several scientists in different directions during at least a couple of decades, we knew more and more how the species and populations function on the island, and the importance of surrounding marine area was recognized, and it became clear that without protecting surrounding marine area, surrounding waters, protection of the even land, purely land ecosystem would not be enough. And therefore, in November, in autumn 1997, we succeeded. I was part of this event of this initiative, along with some of my colleagues. We succeeded in assigning status of strictly protected marine area around all Wrangel Island and Herald Island, including 12 nautical miles zone of territorial waters. But the next step was made 2 years later, when we again succeeded in convincing to increase protective zone to protective buffer zone, which has a lower protective status, but still provides some protections around strictly protected marine area. And the buffer zone was 24 nautical miles. Therefore, Wrangel Island became the first not only land, but also marine Arctic nature reserve. And it was very important because we understood from our data, from our research, that practically all species of higher vertebrates depend on ice, use it intensively, go far in the ice, and for ice habitats, in other words, sea habitats, are very important for even purely terrestrial species such like foxes, but for many bird species as well, not only for polar bears and not only for marine mammals. So nowadays, the size of this protected natural territory is more than 56,000 square kilometers, which includes land, almost 8,000 square kilometers, and marine area, which is almost 49,000 square kilometers. And from this protected area, 11,500 square kilometers is a status of strict nature reserve. It is full protection. It meant full protection, and almost 38,000 square kilometers is a protective buffer zone in sea. From our studies and from not only at Wrangel Island, of course, we know that in the Arctic in particular, the coastline is a very important, ecologically very active and important zone where marine and land ecosystems closely interact. And in my opinion, it is as an ecologically active zone, it is more important than probably in tropical seas or southern seas. And if we look at the bathymetric map of the Arctic Ocean, we see that the island is right in the middle of the very vast zone of continental shelf in the Eurasia, and practically the only big land mass in the entire eastern part of the Eurasian Arctic, which means, of course, that it is a very important living and survival habitat for practically all species, not only for land, but also for marine. And in the recent decades, not years, but decades, starting in practically early 90s, when ice was started obviously degrading in this region. The first year when ice was gone completely in the surrounding sea was 1990. We see that the island is frequently, the water surrounding island are frequently visited by whales, number of whales, and recently gray whales, which largely use marine area of Chukchi Sea, and now penetrate as far in the Arctic as to New Siberian and the Long Island. In 2011, we, for the first time, recorded gray whales in the marine area of the Long Islands. The report on that was published. And practically every summer, number of whales, two species, not to speak about pinnipeds like walruses and seals, are actively, very actively using marine area around Wrangel Island. So now the structure of protected area on the island and around it looks like this. The blue zone is strictly protected nature reserve in surrounding waters, coastal waters, and the pink is protective buffer zone. The corridor on the southern to the southern shore of Wrangel Island was left in the status of buffer zone because there was the only village, the only functioning settlement on the island. So we especially planned it that way to provide access for ships to the settlement, to serve the settlement, so that they will not be crossing fully strictly protected marine area around the island. Now, if we look at the productivity, and here I refer to the article published by several authors in 2016, where they analyzed plankton situation in the Arctic Ocean from 1950, basing on data from 1950 through 2012, then we see that the highest productivity of the Arctic Sea is in Chirikov Basin, which is all northern part of Bering Sea, is in the southern part yellow, dark yellow and light yellow zones here, which is southern Chukchi Sea and northern Chukchi Sea. The blue to the west of these yellow zones is Siberian Sea. Practically on this chart, it includes also western part of Chukchi Sea, because Wrangel Island is right on the border between East Siberian Sea and Chukchi Sea. So the blue is the area of low plankton productivity. But so if we look at the bottom of the trophic system in the Arctic, we see that the highest sea productivity at the bottom level is east from Wrangel, is in the central part of Beringian Arctic waters in the Chukchi Sea. But if we look at the higher level of trophic system in the Arctic, we see that the highest activity of all high level animals are concentrated just around Wrangel, or I may say in Wrangel Island region, which is understandable because they use the combination of land, coastal, and marine habitats. So in the Arctic, I may say situation with interaction between land, coastal, and marine ecosystems is as habitats for wildlife is opposite to Antarctic. If in the Antarctic we see that there is no land life and all use of coastal habitats, it's a spill of life from marine ecosystems, then in the Arctic, wildlife from land terrestrial ecosystems spills on the ice, and ice marine habitats, frozen marine habitats, form a very important part of their survival platform. Such species like Arctic foxes would not be able to survive during years of lemming loss, for example, if they do not largely shift and use ice habitats. So what conclusions should be made from this? If we consider the example of Wrangel Island, we see that this was conservation success. The model was created when, was implemented when both land and marine ecosystems in the Arctic were receiving the same fully protected status and formed the system functionally important and effective. But is it enough? No, it is not, because there is these systems are closely linked, functionally linked with pelagic marine zones. And if pelagic marine zones are not fully protected, then in our rapidly developing world, this system would be losing its effectiveness as a territorial conservation. So the conclusions, brief conclusions that I could make from this example are: first, protective status for pelagic marine areas is needed to make the system more complete and effectively functional for true conservation of the Arctic environment. Protected pelagic marine areas should be large enough to effectively cover the full complexity of ecological components and also the key components of the open or pelagic marine ecosystems. Border delineation based on square pattern concept should be considered for pelagic marine areas because they are dynamic, they are open, and they are rapidly changing and responding to the changing climate and conditions. And finally, precautionary principle and proactive approach should be used for identifying areas, marine areas to be protected, or for implementing protective measures. This last point seems to be obvious, but it's not followed. In all cases, our conservation activity is running far behind the train. We stick in discussing, negotiating, looking for more evidences. Research and discussions could continue forever. My point is that by now we know, understand enough to make territorial conservation, protection of both Arctic and Antarctic marine and land ecosystems effective, and we have to take this effort and go with this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikita. That was a fantastic talk. And I'm sure for some of the audience who might be slightly less familiar with this particular area of the polar regions, that was especially interesting. I do have a lot of questions, but I'm afraid in the interest of time, I'm going to save them for the panel discussion. And right now we are going to proceed to the next talk and come back from the Arctic to the other pole, to the Antarctic region. And for the next 15 minutes, we have a talk from Cassandra Brooks, which is going to be a pre-recorded talk. Unfortunately, Cassandra couldn't join us today due to the time zone differences, but we still look forward to listening to this talk about the Rossi in the Antarctica. And without any further delays, I'm just going to start the recording now.
First, thanks so much for having me here today. It's truly an honor. So I need to start by taking you to Antarctica, this icy continent at the bottom of the world. And I want to share with you that before the continent was discovered, the ancient Greeks insisted that a great southern land must exist in symmetry with the north. Without it, they said, the entire earth would topple over. And I love this metaphor because the Greeks were right. Because since its discovery, scientists have documented that the Antarctic stores 90% of the Earth's fresh water, it regulates our climate, and drives global ocean circulation. And despite its harsh conditions, the Antarctic waters teem with life. Indeed, the Antarctic contains some of our last healthy marine ecosystems. Part of the reason we have healthy marine ecosystems is that Antarctica has been protected by ice and remoteness, but also political will. In the Antarctic, we have a rich history of exploration and science that has created a framework for international collaboration. And I want to highlight the scientific collaboration of the 1957-58 International Geophysical Year, which led directly to a political collaboration and the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959 at the height of the Cold War. The treaty sets aside the entire continent for the sake of peace and science. Under the Antarctic Treaty System is the Convention on the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CAMLR, which manages the waters around Antarctica. In line with the principles of the treaty, grounded in science and precaution, CAMLR is actually considered a leader in marine resource management. They currently have 25 member states plus the European Union, who meet every year over a 2-week period in Hobart, Australia, to negotiate policy decisions, all of which are made by consensus. Currently, there are 2 main commercial fisheries in the Southern Ocean. For Antarctic krill, you can see a picture of krill in front of you. They're a small shrimp-like crustacean that is the key prey species in the Southern Ocean food web. The other fishery is for toothfishes, Patagonian and Antarctic toothfishes, the top fish predators in the Southern Ocean, which are sold as Chilean sea bass. You can see how large they grow in that picture in front of you. There's increasing pressure to fish these species in line with global fishing trends. Indeed, according to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, 90% of our global fisheries are fully exploited, overexploited, or collapsed, meaning that fishing vessels have had to venture into deeper and more remote waters, putting increasing pressure on expanding fishing in the Southern Ocean. Meanwhile, the system is struggling to adapt to climate change. The Antarctic is among the fastest changing places on Earth. These physical changes threaten the health of Antarctic marine ecosystems and all the species that live there. And this is not just about Antarctica. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, released a special report focused on oceans and cryosphere, our ice system, in 2019, and noted that all people on Earth depend directly or indirectly on the ocean and cryosphere. This report further made clear that if we do not act with urgency, we and the future generations will suffer greatly. The IPCC report offered 2 clear policy solutions. First, reduce emissions. We have to do that. Second, implement large-scale protected areas. So marine protected areas are areas where human activities are restricted to meet specific conservation, protection, or fisheries management objectives. They're an increasingly popular tool for conserving marine biodiversity and managing fisheries, including offering resilience to impacts of climate change. MPAs were actually always part of the Hamler Convention under Article 9, which allows for closing areas for science or conservation purposes. And in 2002, in line with global agreements, Hamler committed to a Southern Ocean network of marine protected areas. Hamler adopted the world's first international MPA in 2009, south of the South Orkney Islands. You can see it on yellow in the map in front of you. So this emerging movement towards MPAs in the Southern Ocean, which conflicts with these most remote fisheries and one of the world's last resource frontiers, poses a timely and relevant opportunity to study a collective action problem and to ask the question of, under what conditions do communities conserve the global commons? Here I'm presenting to you results from a 5-year case study of the Hamler MPA process focused on the Ross Sea. Much of the work I'm presenting today is from a paper published last year in Conservation Letters. And I focus on the Ross Sea because among scientists, conservationists, and national governments, the Ross Sea was a priority area for protection. In a global assessment of impacts on the world's oceans, the Ross Sea was deemed to be the healthiest large marine ecosystem left in the world. Again, noting that all decisions at Hamler are made by consensus, I want to walk you through this process of getting all Hamler members to agree. At the time of the Ross Sea negotiations, it was 24 states plus the EU who all had to agree. You can see the states on the left and the curve of building the consensus on the right. This process usually starts with new ideas and early adopters, and then there's this period of mainstream endorsement. And finally, at the end, there can be those who continue to object. And this is generally that process of building to consensus. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip the early years in the process and start in 2012, when a proposal for a Ross Sea MPA was first brought to Hamler by the United States and New Zealand. But know that there was a decade of work by scientists underpinning this proposal, which was deemed by Hamler's scientific committee to be based on the best available science. When the proposal did come forward in 2012, more than half of the commission states supported this original proposal. You can see a map of the proposal at the top of the figure, and you can see the states which supported it there on the curve. In 2013, after a high-profile special meeting of the Commission and its scientific committee, and after a reduction in size of the MPA, removing northern areas, more states joined in consensus. In 2014, even more states joined in consensus, leaving China and Russia as the last 2 states who did not support a Ross Sea region MPA. So negotiations moved slowly, and research interviews I conducted at Hamler in 2014 suggested that getting consensus was really complicated. Some of the words the interviewees used to describe the scene regarding MPAs at Hamler was antagonistic, hostile, stagnant, stalled, divided. That the MPA process was ruined, deadlocked, at a dead end, no road open, no hope, that positions had become entrenched, that finding commonality was difficult, that the process has gone on too long, becoming divisive and polarized, and that trust was gone or broken in Hamler. Issues of trust stemmed from a variety of sources. Many interviewees mentioned that the MPAs were based on political rather than ecological boundaries. So some of this lack of trust was based on accusations that the MPA boundaries were based on these historic sovereignty claims that you can see on the map in front of you. These claims were suspended under the signing of the Antarctic Treaty in 1959. However, they often drive where countries conduct science. These are often the places where countries have scientific bases. It often drives where they lead conservation initiatives. There was also an issue of unequal economic trade-offs. On the map in front of you, the red circles indicate total allowable catches for krill, and the green circles indicate allowable catches for toothfish. In short, many of the large subantarctic toothfish fisheries in particular occur north of the Antarctic Treaty area, where sovereignty is not suspended, and thus in exclusive economic zones of individual countries who have sovereignty claims of subantarctic islands. In fact, the only large toothfish fishery open to all countries is in the Ross Sea. And indeed, the Ross Sea MPA ended up being designed around accommodating fishing interests to some degree. In front of you is the outcome of a conservation ranking study completed, which helped inform the boundaries of the Ross Sea region MPA. The conservation ranking goes from dark blue to light blue, with the areas of highest conservation value being in dark blue. Quickly, if you look at the map, you can see that the dark blue regions are largely on the Ross Sea shelf and slope and on the seamounts in the north. You can see the boundaries of the MPA in its modified version here in 2015 in black. Island Blanc was absolutely a priority area for scientists because it's highly productive and important to predators. And you can again see Island Bank in dark blue with the arrow in black pointing to it. But Island Bank was left out of the MPA boundaries because it was a core fishing area. You can see the main toothfish fishing areas in yellow in front of you, and you can see that they overlap very much with Island Bank. Further, you can see in the yellow outline the part of the shelf and slope in the SRZ, or Special Research Zone. This area was designed to be included in the MPA as an important reference area, but to allow a low level of commercial fishing to support the toothfish tag recapture program. Thus, this area actually became a compromise where it would be included in the MPA, but with limited commercial fishing allowed. You can see that overall, the MPA was designed to protect biodiversity, but it did accommodate core commercial fishing grounds. And while I've noted this accommodation, I must also note that 70% of the MPA encompassed no-take zones where fishing was forbidden, including in many areas on the shelf and slope. On this map, you can see that the Ross Sea is a very busy place in terms of fishing. Each flag on the map is a vessel which notified to fish. This is from the 2015-16 season. And you can see the growing fishing interest in the Southern Ocean, in the Ross Sea, the Antarctic Peninsula, and beyond. So despite the accommodations made in the Rossi proposal, there was still concern among some CAMLAR states about how MPAs in general in CAMLAR would interfere not just with current fishing interests, but with potential future fishing interests and the precedent that these MPAs would set going forward. And of course, there were external issues outside of the room at CAMLAR which influenced the negotiations that had nothing to do with the MPAs themselves. The US, together with New Zealand, was leading the charge on a Rossi MPA, and geopolitical tensions with Russia were detrimental to negotiations. Many interviewees described a Cold War feel in the room during MPA negotiations. And this meant that for some of the years of negotiations, there just was no political window of opportunity. I want to back out a minute to show you what was happening outside of the CAMLAR negotiation room. During this time, scientists from across the world were putting pressure on CAMLAR, calling for protection of the Ross Sea, to have a living laboratory for studying how a healthy marine ecosystem functions. Global conservation groups generated a flood of media, policy reports, and outreach advocating for protecting the Ross Sea. Millions of public citizens engaged in this campaign. Ultimately, these communities got the attention of former Secretary of State John Kerry, who then committed to working at the highest level towards a Ross Sea MPA. Due to John Kerry's efforts, President Obama incorporated a Ross Sea MPA into part of climate negotiations with China in 2015. This then facilitated China's support for Ross Sea MPA in 2015. China also negotiated adding a krill research zone, which you can see in the map on the top, and a limited duration for the MPA, potentially protecting future interests. Negotiations resumed in 2016, presenting a potential political window of opportunity with Russia isolated and Secretary Kerry's term coming to an end. There was also a real opportunity for Russian leadership during this meeting. Russia was chairing the meeting, they had a new Minister of Ecology, and was coming up on celebrating the 200th anniversary of discovering the Antarctic continent. And indeed, on October 28, 2016, after 10 years of working towards this effort, including 5 years of intensive negotiations, CAMLAR finally came to consensus to adopt the world's largest MPA in the Ross Sea Antarctica. And in that moment, the room exploded in applause. Nations were hugging nations, and it became clear that this was not just an environmental win and a gift to future generations, though of course it was both of those things. But it also was like the signing of the Antarctic Treaty as a peace treaty in the height of the Cold War. This was a diplomatic win and showed that despite tensions between some countries, the Antarctic continues to be an exceptional space dedicated to peace and science. In front of you is a map of the Ross Sea MPA that the CAMLAR Secretariat printed after its adoption and invited all the delegations to come up and sign it. It was clear it was an immediate source of pride for CAMLAR, and this map is actually currently framed in CAMLAR's headquarters in Hobart, Australia. Reflecting back, how was consensus achieved on a Ross Sea MPA? Well, we worked at the intersection of science, policy, and the public. And I cannot underestimate the role of public engagement, the huge scientific effort that went into this, combined with the high-level diplomacy, negotiating trade-offs, building and at times breaking and rebuilding trust, working with opportunities for leadership, which all led to this political window of opportunity. And there's a critically important element that intersects that science policy public interface, and that's the role of individual people who elegantly navigated this space. Since the Rossi has been implemented, there has been active enforcement, management, research, and monitoring. CAMLR has a suite of conservation measures that regulate activities, shown in the table at the bottom in front of you. And other conventions are also involved, like the Antarctic mining ban under the Environmental Protocol. There's been no illegal, unregulated, or unreported IUU fishing. None of this has been confirmed. There's been no IUU. There's also a very active research and monitoring being carried out by the United States, New Zealand, Italy, and others. There's been hundreds of studies that have been completed since 2010, providing baseline data on indicator species, and there are dozens of active research projects. The Rossi Region MPA thus sets a good precedent to illustrate what a highly protected MPA in international waters could look like, how it could be adopted, and showcasing that it can be actively managed. And the Rossi MPA is just a start. You can see it there at the bottom of the map. And again, it was adopted in 2016. It's been enforced since 2017, and it is largely off limits to fishing. More than 70% of it is. But CAMLR committed to a network of MPAs that would represent biodiversity in key ecological areas throughout the Southern Ocean. There are actually 3 more critically important MPAs under negotiation at CAMLR right now, including in the East Antarctic, Weddell Sea, and the Western Antarctic Peninsula, or Domain 1. You can see those on the map in front of you. And while adoption in 2021 right now does not seem possible, we've had online meetings for CAMLR for the last 2 years, and online diplomacy is much more difficult to do. I'll just leave it at that. But I am hopeful that CAMLR and its member states will find the political will to move on these critically important conservation initiatives in 2022. So with that, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Cassandra. That was a fantastic and very interesting talk. And we've already heard a little bit of the Rossi in the very first and second presentation in the first half of the day by Rodolfo and Елена. So it was really interesting to explore more about some context about the Rossi MPA. And I particularly like the political and ecological boundaries concept, which I'm hoping we can come back to later in the panel discussion. But for now, we are going to proceed to the final talk of our session today. So we've had some case studies from the Arctic and from the Antarctic. And in the last talk, we are going to look in the areas beyond the national jurisdiction. And I'm very pleased and honored to invite Kristina Gjerde, the Senior High Sea Advisor of the IUCN Global Marine and Polar Program. And I believe that despite the horrific time difference, Kristina joined us today in person. So whenever you are ready, you can share your screen and we look forward to your presentation.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon. It is indeed a pleasure and an honor to be able to join with you. Despite the early hour, for some of us, this is an issue that many of us care passionately about. So it's a wonderful opportunity to join with you today to talk about the importance of conserving collectively marine biodiversity, marine areas beyond national jurisdiction. So as Anna said, I'm Senior High Seas Advisor to IUCN's Global Marine and Polar Program. I'm also an adjunct professor of international ocean law at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey, California, where I teach rising international environmental policy experts about the importance of using the tools we have available to us for improving the state of the planet. Ocean conservation is, of course, front and center as it takes such a large part of our planet and our attention these days. I had the privilege to be involved in the final stages of the 10-year Census of Marine Life, which was an international collaborative effort from 2000 to 2010, which really helped to put, in many ways, the high seas and the deep ocean on the map. Through this international collaborative effort, they developed new technologies to track individual animals as they cross the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean basin as around the world. That represent the migrations of elephant seals, sharks, tuna, bluefin tuna, as well as whales, that really enabled us to gain insights on the habitat preferences and needs of many highly migratory species, and also the shifting of the ecosystems. It further unveiled new ecosystems and new species, many beyond our wildest imaginations. But the message I'd like to convey with this image, this map, is really the notion that we are one interconnected ocean, and what we do in any one part of our planet affects the well-being of us all, and hence international collaboration is absolutely essential. But as a lawyer and a passionate amateur scientist, it's obvious that we have some challenges. That's under the law of the Sea Convention, the International Framework Convention that sets forth the rights and obligations of states in the ocean world, divides the ocean into areas within national jurisdiction, the exclusive economic zones, often out to 200 nautical miles, the interterritorial sea of 12 nautical miles, and then, of course, the high seas and the seabed below, called the area, which is in fact deemed the common heritage of mankind as a whole. So we have these different jurisdictions and different rights and responsibilities, but really, because the ocean is so interconnected through its currents, its transport, its larvae, its migratory species, we really need to think of this as one world ocean and find ways to better manage it collectively, while of course respecting the rights of nations within their exclusive economic zones. But cooperation is key. So I'd like to give a little overview of the past, present, and future evolution of international conservation for our ocean space. I like to use this cosmic jelly, which is one of these weird mesopelagic organisms that has the unique capacity to look down to see where it's been, as well as to look up and to look ahead. It sort of, to me, symbolizes our need to deploy all of our senses, all of our sensibilities to really plan ahead while being able to act now on the basis of the information we have to hand. That's, as we know, the ocean's temperature has been increasing by 1.5 degrees in the last century, but that's just the average temperature, that some areas have warmed much more severely, both steadily as well as in these now increasingly frequent heat waves. I experienced one when I was in California in 2015. It truly was devastating to the local ecosystems as well as the local economies of deoxygenation, of fish kills, of harmful algal blooms. These are becoming more intense and more frequent. We need to start finding ways to incorporate these marine heat waves and other unexpected events into our planning and management. We're starting to get a handle on what do we need to do from the management side to improve our capacity to respond, to enhance ocean resilience. We need improved climatological forecasting and, of course, ongoing and deep ocean observations and monitoring. We need to be able to respond proactively to indications there may be a marine heat wave coming and reduce pressures on marine ecosystems and marine resources. Reducing quotas is one example. We need to design marine protected areas. We need to implement, we need to adopt marine protected areas, but we need to be able to put them in places where they will be able to adapt to climate change. And we can identify places specifically to enhance climate resilience. But of course, we also need more marine protected areas. We need larger networks of marine protected areas in order to create those climate refugia, migratory pathways for many marine species and to plan for the future. And of course, we need to reduce these other stressors from pollution, from noise, from water quality degradation, and other habitat disturbance as we move forward, if we want to plan for a healthy and sustainable ocean. One overarching tool that you can see has been recommended, highlighted by the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, in the Second World Ocean Assessment that was published earlier this year, is that really to ensure sustainability on our ocean planet, we need to work together to advance integrated ocean management. And this involves, of course, joint research, capacity development, and the sharing of data, information, and technology. We need to enable all states, all stakeholders to be able to have access to the tools they need in order to protect their own marine environment and to join forces to protect our global shared ocean and resources. But of course, the challenge for lawyers is how do you achieve this joined up integrated ocean management in a world of fragmented ocean governance? Yes, as I said, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea provides the overarching framework of rights, responsibilities, and duties, but it focuses mainly on economic activities like fishing, shipping, and seabed mining, laying out the rules and responsibilities there, and establishes or recognizes the existence of specific organizations, regional fisheries management organizations, International Maritime Organization for Shipping, and the International Seabed Authority. The challenge is that even though the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has provisions for requirements for protecting and preserving the marine environment, including rare and fragile ecosystems and the habitat of threatened, endangered, and depleted species, there's no mechanisms at play currently for enacting those responsibilities in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And that is why so many of us have been involved, for me, the past 2 decades in trying to encourage the United Nations to yes, deploy existing international legal tools and organizations, but also to develop an international legally binding agreement for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. Why that's important, we'll get to in a moment. But back to closer to your home is what we're recognizing is that climate change is changing everything. Is putting new stressors on institutions as well as ecosystems. And this is going to hopefully create the conditions for our institutions to adapt to these changing conditions. We need them to be able to take decisions, we need them to move boldly ahead, and to be able to proactively respond, if you will, to indications of science to enhance and ensure that continued resilience of ocean ecosystems and species, as well as in the context of ongoing activities. So as Professors Villigjanen, Oren Young, and Paul Bergman, who's with us today, have talked about in a recent article, is that, well, recognizing the tremendous achievements of the Arctic Council, that under these new conditions, it may behoove the members of the Russian Council, the Arctic Council, now led by Russia, to actually consider how can you adapt the Arctic governance system to recognize the need to respond more proactively to these changing conditions, the challenges of a melting Arctic. That others are also starting to question the more fundamentally, the fitness for purpose of existing legal frameworks, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. The lawyers in the room will join me in sort of shuddering at this thought of renegotiating a critically important international legal instrument that took 10 years to find this fine balance. But there are jagged edges in that balance today caused by failures to implement it properly, but also by new pressures. So the UK Parliament is currently actually accepting submissions regarding the need to renegotiate the Law of the Sea Convention, or how do we otherwise adapt it so it is indeed fit for purpose in the 21st and 22nd century. So I encourage you to get involved, to recognize that this initiative is underway, but that together we may be more fit to try to find better mechanisms, such as this BB&J agreement, such as in the adoption proactively of marine protected areas and other mechanisms to reduce our footprint on the marine environment now and not 20 years later. So for the scientists in the room, this is where I do my field work, as my colleague Harriet Hardin-Davies likes to say. This is the one of the United Nations rooms in the basement where meetings go forward. For the past 2 years, there have been this intergovernmental conference negotiating a new international legally binding agreement. This builds on nearly 20 years, well, let's say 18 years of discussion, study, considerations, do or do we not need a new international legally binding agreement. But finally, in 2015, government said, yeah, okay, let's consider this seriously. And in 2018, they launched the negotiations. But only 3 have taken place. The 4th and final meeting was supposed to happen in March of 2020, but like the rest of our lives, was put on hold. And the next and hopefully final negotiation is scheduled to take place in March of 2022, next year. So this gives us now just a little time to actually get our act together in order to create a new agreement for marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction that is indeed fit for purpose to take us as well as marine life across generations into the 22nd century, as Paul Bergman likes to say. So what are the elements of this BBNJ agreement? Well, one key element, of course, is to continue that network of marine protected areas, but also looking at other types of area-based management tools. Environmental impact assessments, capacity building and technology transfer, marine genetic resources, and then these cross-cutting institutional issues like the powers of the Conference of Parties, components of the scientific and technical advisory body that most people agree is desperately needed in order to review proposals for marine protected areas, environmental impact assessments, and so on. And then, of course, financial underpinning of a new agreement. How are we going to actually create the funding system to enable the capacity building, the benefit sharing, the review of environmental impact assessments, and assistance with conducting them when needed? So I'd just like to backtrack for a moment to say this is not springing out of nowhere. Since 2004, 2005, the Convention on Biological Diversity has actually been discussing options for advancing cooperation on marine protected areas beyond national jurisdiction. When the state parties said, well, the role of the CBD in this context should focus on advancing science and technological information, the parties focused on developing these criteria based on decades of experience with marine protected areas within national jurisdiction, so-called EBSA criteria, uniqueness, special importance. I think you've heard plenty about this already from our prior speakers. But what was exciting is that they then actually launched, with the Secretariat's support and the support of the Japanese government and others, an initiative to bring experts together to start talking about what areas meet these criteria that are in need of advanced protection, priority protection. Well, they've described more than 300 of these places so far, both big and little, covering entire boundary currents. As you can see, some are quite large, but this is to recognize in some part that the ocean moves and it's dynamic, and that they signal which ones are dynamic, but also signaling that we need ideally to adapt our management tools in order to reflect this dynamism of the marine environment. Some animals go north up in the northern boundary current, and then they return in the south. We know that from the tagging and tracking activities. So how can the BBNJ agreement actually help advance the system of marine protected areas? Well, first and foremost, it can help to align the priorities for ocean health, productivity, and resilience. It can help to align our principles of the state's parties and use their influence in existing organizations to advance ecosystem-based management, to advance precautionary decision-making. And of course, can help to align the processes. So there's common standards for environmental impact assessments, for transparency, for consultation, for participation, and reporting. Area-based management tools, the provisions that are under discussion, can help us to proactively protect ocean biodiversity, health, and resilience. MPA networks are a key tool that can be advanced through this BBNJ agreement. We also need to start talking about corridors to protect the migratory species and also the adaptation needs as the thermal bands shift. And of course, developing these marine protected areas and other area-based management tools needs to be supported by strong science-based collaboration, as well as the adoption of complementary measures by all actors in the other sectors. We need provisions for enhancing cooperation within our institutions as well as between states. Environmental impact assessments are, of course, another essential tool to help ensure the sustainability of activities outside of marine protected areas through having a shared objective of ocean health, by having a common trigger. So states are aware, private actors are aware of what level of activity may trigger that obligation. We can build on experience in the Antarctic Madrid Protocol for EIAs. But requiring an impact assessment is not a simple process. You can get assistance in making sure that you're asking the right questions. Consultation, participation are absolutely vital. You want to know, as a state, what activities are going on outside your exclusive economic zone that may have an impact on your environmental and economic interests. So in short, where I'm trying to go is that in a dynamic and an increasingly stressed ocean, we need to deploy all of our existing tools to improve our management, to proactively protect priority areas using the science we have available today. But we need to be constantly on our toes and collaborating to advance that underlying science basis. This is just one example of how scientists got together from different disciplines to, one, identify where currents go, and then two, with the Sea Turtle Watch, to actually understand the thermal preferences of endangered sea turtles. If you combine those two together, you can start to adopt measures to avoid interactions or bycatch with sea turtles while you're fishing for tuna. It can be much cheaper economically as a way to help enhance protection for endangered species on the high seas. So with colleagues from the Global Ocean Biodiversity Initiative, the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, the IUCN's World Commission on Environmental Law, and the World Commission on Protected Areas, we're bringing people together to start trying to hammer out how do you best act now for resilience through this BBNJ agreement, but also how do we start planning better for change. And one of the tools that I'm hoping we can explore here more in detail is utilizing these integrated ecosystem assessments to help advance a common understanding, and with that, support for proactive protection measures that we've heard are so desperately needed. As my colleague, Professor Paul Arthur Berkman likes to point out in this recent article, is the Central Arctic, and we can see in the Central Arctic Ocean work on integrated ecosystem assessments, is they really provide a framework to both formulate the key questions, where are we headed, what's happening, what are the stressors, what's the socioeconomic activities, and then to gather the essential data from the multiple disciplines, the multiple stakeholders who are out there. We can distill the evidence together and help frame those options together to identify what are the key pathways forward for a healthy and resilient and productive ocean. And it's through this co-production of knowledge that we can help to pursue informed decision-making, truly for the benefit of all. I'm excited to say that I'm on the advisory board of one project in the Atlantic that is doing a similar thing, only it's looking at an entire ocean basin, trying to understand the connectivities between the North and South. And while learning what the impacts of multiple stressors are, understanding ecosystem change, working hand in hand with partners from the Southern Atlantic Ocean to build knowledge, to share and exchange information, experiences, and to build those sorts of long-lasting friendships that are really the core for international collaborative efforts. We can all gain from that. And just sort of to highlight another core element of the BBNJ agreement and how we can all benefit is, of course, the focus on sharing the benefits of marine genetic resources. We too often focus solely on the complex issues of biodiscovery, biotechnology. Where is this genetic resource from? But at the same time, other scientists, technology is rapidly evolving, where you can help to use barcoding and meta barcoding to identify what species of shark are either living or dead on the bottom of a confiscated container to help with enforcement as well as monitoring. You can identify key species, niches for cryptic species you thought were lost to the planet. And there's so many emerging tools, and the US NOAA has sort of framed a strategy for advancing these omic tools for accelerating US capacity for ocean management assessments and monitoring. We need to be able to do the same, and we can do the same through the BB&J agreement. And just to try to bring this all together, what do I see as the role of the integrated ecosystem assessments as a core part of the BB&J agreement on environmental impact assessments, strategic environmental assessments, and then regional integrated ecosystem assessments. It can help by bringing all the disciplines together to advance our scientific understanding of ocean drivers, stressors, drivers, biodiversity patterns, as well as the need for response, options for responses. It can increase the access to data, information. More people you involved, including the stakeholders of shipping and fishing communities, the more information you can get access to, and of course, tools and technologies. It can help to therefore strengthen the basis for environmental impact assessments. You can build off of pre-existing knowledge. Similarly for strategic environmental assessments, which you can help to assess the potential range of effects of proposed plans, policies, or even new technologies, new activities per se, rather than site-specific. And then, of course, help to plan out system of marine protected area networks and other area-based management tools. And of course, together, this can help to increase the sustainability of ongoing activities as well as their interactions with one another. So I'm really excited about these opportunities for deploying the best available scientific tools, technologies, and people to advance integrated ecosystem assessments as a core part of the BB&J agreement, as well as through the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. You've seen that there's a project in the Atlantic Ocean. It's just a project, it may stop. We need ongoing studies there, as well as in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean to match what is going on in the Central Arctic. You have all heard already about the UN Decade of Ocean Science and what it is aiming for, which is truly the transformative ocean science solutions, bringing people together to solve common problems that the solutions can truly benefit all. I'm excited. So wrapping this up, looking towards the future, how might Russia, the Russian government, and Russian scientists benefit from this BB&J agreement? Well, first and foremost is it can provide us the tools to combat the rising threats to marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction through ambitious, timely, and integrated action to safeguard global ocean health across generations. And of course, this needs to be accompanied by equally ambitious action in Glasgow in the coming weeks to help reduce the growing rate of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. But for all, it can help to foster international collaboration, cooperation. For scientists, it can enhance access to information about cruise opportunities, access to information collected in one part of the world that may be key to understanding the puzzle of change in your part of the world. It can help to encourage and spur innovation, research topics, new ways of transdisciplinary cooperation. I think it's really an exciting time for scientists around the world. For the lawyers, they may be more scared because of these increasing pressures on our existing legal system, but the BB&J agreement offers the opportunity for stability in the rule of law for area-based management tools through provisions for environmental impact assessments and ongoing conference of parties to talk about issues. We can evolve the BB&J agreement, but there can be a predictability, a certainty, and ensured respect for the rule of law in the ocean. absolutely critical in this day of increasing illegal fishing, of drug smuggling, you name it. And then again, most importantly, for the lawyers, is we need to find ways to maintain the integrity of the Law of the Sea Convention, those territorial boundaries that are so vital to national security, national interest. Yes, they need to be respected, but we also need to recognize the vital ecological interest that we all share in healthy, productive, resilient oceans, both within and beyond national jurisdiction. The BBNJ agreement can provide us the tools to enhance that level of cooperation between national waters, international waters, across the sectors, and with the species that we share our ocean planet with. So I hope you will join in further efforts to pull all these efforts together in one long circle like the siphonophore, and really find ways we can work together in our different capacities towards a more sustainable, equitable, and prosperous future for us and our ocean planet. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much indeed, Kristina. That was a fantastic overview presentation that brought together a lot of different concepts that were covered in some of the other talks. And I'm hoping that we should be able to discover more of them in the next sort of 20-25 minutes during the panel discussion. And I wanted to just very briefly remind everyone, who do we have today with us live to join the panel? So we have Kristina Gjerde, who we just heard from. We also have Professor Callum Roberts, Dr. Nikita Ovsyannikov, and Елена Жаркова. And the overarching question of this panel discussion would probably be, what can we do better to achieve those MBA targets that we were talking about in the polar regions and really globally. So yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box or raise your hand. And I will probably start with coming back to Kristina and asking the question that I have already asked Callum earlier. So what do you think are the realistic targets that we should have in protecting our oceans? Does 30 by 30 sound like something that is both reasonable to achieve and actually going to help us to achieve sustainable oceans? Or what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I would say quite simply that 30 by 30 as a goal is absolutely essential. It's the only thing that moves nations forward. It gives us a measurable target. It gives us incentives for reaching that target, and it provides some level of a huge level of international support, as well as expectations of action. And I would say that the high seas and the seabed is comprising that 64% of our ocean is a absolutely vital area to start protecting as well, using these 30 by 30 targets. So yes, it's an absolutely essential way to propel international collaboration, cooperation to assist all nations to better protect our ocean environment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kristina. Talking about international collaboration and cooperation, you've mentioned your colleague, Professor Paul Berkman, who's with us today. And I believe that Paul is a great specialist in science diplomacy. So I actually wanted to maybe ask Paul to join the discussion for this one question. And I wanted to ask Paul about science diplomacy. So talking about what we can do better in achieving MPA targets in polar regions and globally, do you think that science diplomacy is something that could help us? How we can really take those discussions into actions? So Paul, if you are happy to unmute yourself, we would like to invite you to join the discussion.
I think the simple lesson is that in most cases, with a diversity of stakeholders, rights holders, actors, the discussions begin with conflict among different perspectives. And the alternative to conflict is common interests. And the Arctic and the Antarctic actually exemplify common interest building, particularly among nations. Starting with the Antarctic Treaty in 1959, the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated continuously throughout the Cold War because the basis of their starting point was common interests, matters of common interest. And I understand from many discussions with Kristina, the challenges, particularly in the deep sea, associated with the Deep Seabed Authority, and various issues and challenges of businesses and environmental perspectives. In a sense, these are adversaries and allies talking to each other. And how do we bridge those gaps is the question. And the observation from science diplomacy is that in any negotiation, there is an option, a choice at the beginning, at the start. You can choose to start the negotiation based on conflict, which means that the various rights holders and actors and stakeholders assert their perspectives. The other option is to start from a position of common interests. And like a glass that is half empty or half full, it's a choice. And the skill of the science diplomat is to serve as a broker among allies and adversaries alike, to facilitate dialogues that would otherwise be intractable because of self-interests. So in terms of how this will help with the biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions, MPA development around the world, the protection of the oceans on a global scale, clearly these are global issues that involve humankind among all nations, all peoples, all cultures. And the challenge really is to think beyond self-interests and to think across a continuum of urgencies that exists from sustainability's timescale across generations, balancing economic, environmental, societal considerations, to a security timescale, mitigating risks of political, economic, and cultural instability that are immediate. And the challenge is it's not one end member or the other. The challenge is to operate short-term to long-term. And in a sense, by talking about the ocean and this rich discussion here, the consideration is into the future. And from my perspective as an individual, just one among 8 billion, as a lifetime objective, it is to offer hope and inspiration to the future. And it is inspirational and hopeful to think in terms of common interests rather than conflict.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you for bringing this concept of common interest with global inclusion. I'm sure that this is something that we can all do better in. And speaking of sort of global to local scales and perspectives, I wanted to come back to Callum and maybe ask you to talk a little bit more about this paper that you've mentioned that was talking about sort of frameworks to MPAs. I was just wondering how to bridge the gap between those sort of major global frameworks and implementing them on regional levels. Do you think this is easy, or are those frameworks, how does it translate from global frameworks to actually regional context?
That's a good question. And I think the main value of the MPA guide is that it provides a framework for assessing the effectiveness of marine protected areas, which can be applied at any scale, from an individual protected area to a national network of protected areas, or even the global network of protected areas. So it's intended to bring transparency and accountability to the process of establishing and managing protected areas. At the moment, countries can declare what they like to the world's database on protected areas, and the database just has to reflect those national submissions without any sort of critical evaluation. So some of those protected areas are really good, some of them do very little at all, and it's hard to distinguish between them. So by looking in a bit more detail and saying, well, what stage of establishment and management is this MPA at, and how much protection is it given, then we can start looking at how the world is moving towards more effective ocean protection, and how countries are moving towards more effective ocean protection. So at the moment, there are a number of national assessments underway by the scientific community and NGO community to look at the performance of different countries. I'm undertaking one myself of the UK with some of my students and postdocs. And so by saying, well, we've evaluated the MPAs here, this is what the picture looks like, it shows whether we're really on the right path or whether we have a long way to go. And I think that this is just a way of really moving the world towards greater effectiveness more quickly than it has been moving up to now.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for this comment, Callum. And yeah, definitely assessing effectiveness is something that is really important in all the context of marine protected areas. But I guess one other important question is sort of protected characteristics. What do we choose as the parameters to establish MPAs in the first place? And that's where I wanted to maybe come back to the Arctic region and to the case study that Nikita was giving to us. So you've mentioned that Wrangel Island itself is a very sort of successful example of a marine protected area, but there might be a need to expand the territory, the protected territory, and maybe establish some pelagic marine ecosystems. I think that's what you've mentioned. So yeah, I just wanted you to maybe comment a little bit more on that. How realistic is it to establish pelagic marine protected areas? Are there certain criteria that we can implement? What we can do better to make this happen with pelagic marine ecosystems? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Anna. Well, I think the establishment of pelagic marine protected area is not a task for just nature reserve, any particular enterprise. Maybe not even can be done within one jurisdiction, but there should be, well, my strong feeling is that there should be a tool to establish marine protected areas in pelagic waters, in pelagic areas beyond the zone of national interests, so that if we know that the area is of critical ecological significance, it should be assigned with protective status. But the question is how to manage the protection of essential key marine areas, which we know are, say, of high productivity or high use by some endangered species within 200 wide zone of national economical interests. That's obviously could be done only within jurisdiction, and then it's a matter of how national scientists or international scientific community can provide essential convincing data for governments, and whether or not governments would listen and consider this information. The success, what I consider a success was Wrangel Island Reserve case, was that in Soviet time, the government was listening to opinion of scientists. And that was just enough. Nowadays, we know much more than we used to know in, say, 60s or 70s or 80s, how these ecosystems function. And still, the opinion of scientists was convincing and was sufficient argument for governmental officials to consider that and take actions. And practically the same happened with our initiative to establish marine protective zone around Wrangel Island. There was not really comprehensive research in this zone. We just knew, we understood how important these frozen marine habitats are for many terrestrial wildlife species. We didn't know what's going on in underwater marine ecosystems because there was no research, and still there is none. But just observing how the habitats are used in both winter when they're frozen and summertime, we can easily understand how important they are. And that was enough argument to move forward. So I think that's the way science has to play the key role, and I would say uncompromised role, because if we know and we are convinced ourselves that it is important, we have to insist that it should be done. Officials come and go, but our knowledge is accumulated over years, and it should be made and considered a powerful tool and argument, and we should work with this. So it's a gamble to a certain extent, but if efforts are not taken, there will be no reasons to expect any success.
Thank you so much, Nikita. Yeah, definitely sort of science-based informed decision-making has been one of the key themes in many talks today. I wanted to follow up on something that you've said. So you said that there is a need to have a framework that would allow us to identify sort of areas of heightened ecological significance or those parameters that need to be protected. So I want to ask another provocative question probably, which is there such a framework? Because we've heard from the talks of some examples and actions towards that. So for example, MARESEDU algorithm has been implemented both in the Rossi in the Antarctic and in the Russian Arctic by WWF. And we know that there are approaches by CBD to identify areas of heightened biological significance. So is this enough, or do we need something better? And this is the question to every panelist. If anyone would like to jump in on that one, please feel free.
So may I start with just expressing my opinion? No, I don't think that's enough. And the reason is that it's not functioning effectively. As I said, we are running much behind the train, and we have to change. You know, the problem is that all our planning proposals are based on parameters taken from the past, from the previous periods. And as practice is showing that we are always far behind. Like with global warming, you know, all predictions based on modeling and on knowledge on the processes, just observable processes from previous years fail, predictions fail, because the process degradation, say, of sea ice habitats is speeding. So that's the reason to be proactive and to give absolute priority to precautionary approach. And that is a question then of priorities, consumptive for political interests or global conservation, which is of interest of everyone, of all nations, all living bodies, all living creatures. So that's just a question of how, in my opinion, if politicians are not able to recognize the importance and priority, they should be displaced because they are not qualified.
Thank you, Nikita. I hope that we can transfer this message. Would anyone else want to comment on this? So how effective do you think are existing frameworks and mechanisms of identifying areas of ecological significance? Kristina, Callum, Елена?
I just want to add one thing, and that is that historically, many species have been depleted in their population sizes from former abundance. And so we're, by focusing only on present day hotspots of ocean life or areas of high biodiversity, we're also missing places that could support very large quantities of life if we gave them the right management. So one of the things that marine protected areas do when you protect them highly from extractive use and damage is that they restore the abundance of ocean life. So you're creating new places where nature can thrive again. And those places may not be prioritized in the kind of traditional exercises of looking for the best places right now. And in the future, of course, the world is changing. So it may be that the places that are really good right now will not be the same places as they will be in the future. So we need to be creating dynamic systems which accommodate both the creation of new sites of biological richness and the protection of sites that we know about right now.
Thank you. Kristina?
I'll just jump in to say that as we've learned with the CBD EBSAs, identification is not enough. It provides no long-lasting or internationally recognized protection. And similarly, use of regional frameworks it's a positive step forward, but it does not get you recognition at the international level by the whole host of states and stakeholders who operate outside of that particular regional framework. In the OSPAR context in Northeast Atlantic, it's only the OSPAR members in the OSPAR Convention for the Conservation of the Northeast Atlantic who are actually bound by any decisions that they take. And hence the role of the BB&J agreement is actually to enable these regional initiatives to be recognized and honored and respected globally. So it's absolutely essential to go beyond that step of, yes, identification. And on the pelagic criteria, that was something that the CBD-EBSA process tried to address, is what are you really looking for? It's not just areas of high fisheries productivity, but it's areas of high plankton productivity, or areas that are essential for supporting various life stages, or areas important for allowing endangered species to expand and to thrive. So there's been a lot of work done in this, but it's clear that we need legally recognized and binding protections.
Thank you so much, Kristina. Unfortunately, at this point, we only have 5 minutes of the session left. That was a fantastic and engaging discussion. But just to wrap it up, I would invite all of our panelists to try and maybe summarize in just 1 minute. So what do you think we can do better to achieve MPA targets in the polar regions and globally? And I will start with passing the microphone to Елена.
Thank you very much. I believe that we can be better in reaching agreements and meet halfways and strive for consensus and rebuild or reschedule, not for the bargaining the situations when some international deals are closed, but we should see the huge international rescue operation, and this rescue operation implies everyone does its best, and it's not a bargain, not an exchange. It means that we all completely committed to the process to save our oceans and high seas.
Thank you so much, Елена. Callum, what would be your answer?
My answer is that I think we need to be deploying the tools that we have at the moment much better while we get the mechanisms in place that people have been talking about to create marine protected area networks. It's going to take some time to conclude the BB&J negotiations. It's then going to take more time to create an international structure to identify and establish protected areas. So in the meantime, we really need to be managing the ocean much better and reducing the impact of fishing and industrial use on ocean space using the other tools that we have.
Thank you. This is certainly a very important message. Nikita?
Well, I'd rather agree with Callum that we have maybe not perfect, but we have many tools and sufficient tools in some cases, which would give much better results if we consistently use these tools and implement them. Also, our knowledge, we now know a lot. We don't need more decades of research. Research is always good, but it can go forever. We just now need know enough to start the process of protecting the ocean more intensively. And then all the other research and all the other finding could be continued, but the priority should be given on the political level to the conservation, global conservation. And just remember and consider that now we're in the age of the 6th mass extinction of species on the planet, which is caused by anthropogenic impact. That's really serious. That's the, environmental catastrophe. It's a universal equalizer. Nobody would be able to escape from the destructive impacts. So that should be given the priority on the political level internationally. If it's done, and the general public should realize that this is the criteria to assess politicians they are voting for. So that's briefly.
Thank you so much, Nikita. Certainly the need for immediate action is something that has also been a theme in many talks today, and reaching the gap between knowledge and policy as well. And I will pass the microphone to Kristina for the final answer on this question, final remark.
Okay, well, thank you for the question. I would love to see and hope to see that the designation of marine protected areas and the establishment of real protective measures becomes not something that is a political bargaining chip, because we are, as Elena said, bargaining away our futures. This needs to become something that is a message from our political leaders that we need to take action now to enhance the resilience of our ocean in this cascade of effects of climate change and other stressors. So we need to create systems where marine protected areas is a matter of business, that conservation of species and habitats is a matter of business as part of a regional fisheries management organization. Until we change that mindset, that this is not just a short-term economic driver, but a long-term existence driver, that we need to protect our ocean because it is protecting the rest of the planet. This needs to translate to all levels of management and governance. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kristina. And thanks again to all the panelists today. I think, probably one of the most important message is this need for an immediate action that all of you highlighted, and also the opportunities to do so through many frameworks and processes that you've covered in all your presentations. And I hope that this session has been inspiring to many early career participants and listeners, and that everyone realizes the importance of taking these actions. I will just stop for 10 seconds to remind everyone that we have another international session later in the day, starting 4 p.m. Moscow time, on biofouling communities and how can we study them. If you're interested, there is still time to register. And with that, we are going to wrap up the session today. And thank you so much once again to all the speakers and panelists, and also all the participants and the audience and people who are watching the live stream on the website, and our technical support and interpreters. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, and we look forward to seeing you later. Thank you so much.